Rabbi, fellow members and guests, say the royal family never apologizes and never makes excuses, but I do have to apologize for what happened up there. I just forgot that I had to do the translation, and I indicated to Michael Romain to say the second bracha before I read the translation. But he saved the day actually by saying the second bracha again, this time in English. So everything turned out all right in the end. The first thing I want to do, as I said I was going to do, is to clarify, if I can, the last few words of the parasha, the portion that I read. Literally it says, God will answer the peace of Pharaoh. Most translations try to, or in fact all translations, try to introduce the word peaceful, or sometimes peaceful, or peace or peaceful here. And I don't find them very satisfactory because it's not the answer, the interpretation of his dream is not going to bring him peace of mind, not knowing that he's going to have 7 prosperous years and then 7 years of famine. I think, in fact, there is an easier solution to this, because there is a similar phrase using the same construction in last week's parasha. Perhaps it was read here, I don't know. You may remember that Jacob tells Joseph to go and see how things are with his brothers who are pasturing the flocks at some distance. And Jacob's words are actually, Lech, go, re'eh, see, et shalom achicha, just like shalom paro that we had here, the peace of your brothers. And the translators have no difficulty in rendering this as, go and see how things are, go and see if all is well with your brothers. In a modern colloquial tone, we would say, see how your brothers are getting on. And in fact, in ordinary day-to-day colloquial Hebrew, you meet somebody in the street, you say, ma shalom cha, or ma shlomech, if it's a woman. What is your peace, literally, which is to say, how are you doing? So I would venture that the meaning of those few words, what Joseph answers Pharaoh, is that the divine answer, communicated, of course, through Joseph, would be to explain the situation to Pharaoh. So perhaps this is how things are going to be, this is what the position is, might be closer to the meaning. Now, having tried to clarify that, let us go to the real subject of this passage, as our Haftarah reader told us as well, which is Shalom, dream, Chet Lamed Mem, and you find this repeated over and over again. The Torah tells us, I'll quote, if there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision and speak to him in a dream. If you want to look for it, it's Numbers chapter 12, verse 6. Now, the interpretation given by the Rambam, by Maimonides in the 12th century, in his Guide to the Perplexed, where he links the Torah so skillfully with the science, with the astronomy, with the cosmology of his time, where the earth was seen as the center of the universe and the planets, the spheres, circled the earth. Maimonides explains that the divine message passes through the planets, who serve as, we might call them boosters or transmitters, in a flow like water overflowing from one basin of a fountain to another, and comes down in visions, like the vision, for example, of Isaiah, begins Chazon Yeshayahu, the vision of Isaiah, or dreams, to certain people who possess extraordinary levels of perception and intellectual refinement. These are the prophets of Israel. And as the Maftir, the Haftarah reader read, we say the Nevi'im Tovim. They are the Nevi'im Tovim, the good prophets, or the Nevi'e Ha'emet. It's also in the phrase, the prophets of truth. And the greatest of them was, as the Rambam tells us, was Moses. Now we know, of course, because we've all read Freud, and we know what dreams are. But we do have another sort of dream, don't we? We have a daydream, a pipe dream, the one which Martin Luther King was speaking about when he said the famous words, "I have a dream." This is the wish fantasy. Now, every time I see this, I think of a little book which I have called The Dream and Its Realization. It's a Hebrew book, so it's called Shalom V'Shivro. This is the autobiography of a man whose name is borne by streets all over Israel. You must have seen them if you've been there. And if you've visited Jerusalem, maybe it's quite likely you had a cup of coffee in Rehov Ben Yehuda Street, one of the main streets in Jerusalem. This man was Eliezer Ben Yehuda. He was one of the great pioneers who urged the use of Hebrew as the normal language for all purposes among Jews living in the land of Israel, in Eretz Israel. The history of this, for me, is intriguing. It's too complex for here and now, so I'll just say a few things about it. When Eliezer ben Yehuda first went to Eretz Israel in 1878, he was a very young man, there were perhaps no more than 50,000 Jews living in the country. They didn't speak Hebrew normally. They spoke perhaps Yiddish, if they had originated in Eastern Europe, or Arabic, if they had come from an Arabic-speaking country, such as Morocco or the Yemen, or if they descended from the oldest of the communities, the descendants of the exiles from Spain in 1492, they spoke Spanish. They did use Hebrew as a spoken language, the only place in the world which did this. That is to say, the men did so because the women were simply not educated in Hebrew. They used Hebrew as a lingua franca. And this is what Eliezer ben Yehuda discovered when he went into shops, went to change money, talked to the driver of the Agala, I suppose we call it the charabanc, which then took him from Jaffa to Jerusalem. And he has this lovely, simple Hebrew phrase, Dibarti lo be'ivrit. I spoke to him in Hebrew, vehu anali be'ivrit, and he answered me in Hebrew, which for him was a remarkable thing because he knew Hebrew very well. He was a yeshiva student, but you didn't speak Hebrew even in places where men knew Hebrew very well. You read it and you wrote it, but you didn't talk it. That Hebrew lingua franca was spoken, as he tells us, in the Spanish or Sephardi pronunciation, probably because the Spanish speakers had been there the longest and had the most prestige, but also because both the Spanish and the Arabic-speaking Jews used it. And that is why that particular pronunciation became the way that Hebrew was pronounced when it did become widespread as a spoken language. And that is why that is the pronunciation of Hebrew in Israel today. Why that pronunciation was adopted by the LJS wasn't always the pronunciation in the LJS. It wasn't the Anglo-Jewish pronunciation, which most of the original LJS members had been used to. You may be surprised if I tell you that it was decided to begin the use of the pronunciation that we use now in 1917, as old as that. And the reason why is quite different from anything which was going on in Jewish Palestine at the time. It's another interesting story, but not for now, I fear. Now that dream that Eliezer ben Yehuda refers to in the title of his autobiography, Shalom, was that Hebrew should be the normal language for everybody and for all purposes, and not just a lingua franca between men. how Hebrew, a language which was not spoken anywhere else or by any other nation, which did not have even the words or the structure to be used for all purposes, became the normal language in Israel, or if you like, among the Jewish population of what was Palestine, is too complex to discuss here. But already in that same year, 1917, when Ben Yehuda's autobiography was first published, the normalization of Hebrew was evident. That's why he says, V'shivro, and its realization, he thought it had been done. Girls, and this was the solution really, the more recent immigrants, the late 1880s and the 1890s and the early part of the 20th century, set up modern schools in which boys and girls were educated, where Hebrew was taught and where Hebrew was used as the medium of instruction for other subjects besides Hebrew itself. When girls are taught, they become mothers and they talk to their babies in Hebrew. So one gets then a generation, the first generation of people for whom Hebrew was the mother language, the language that their mothers had spoken to them. I do remember seeing an advertisement in it was a Hebrew newspaper, I think it was 1902, for a nursery nurse in a baby's home in Jerusalem, where it actually said it is essential that the applicants can speak Hebrew because they wanted the babies to hear Hebrew. We may wonder what Eliezer ben Yehuda would say today when close on half the world's Jewish population speaks Hebrew as their normal tongue. Now, to end, I want to go back to the matter I talked about at the beginning, this word shalom. Of course, it means peace, especially when we wish each other Shabbat Shalom, a Sabbath of peace. However, if you put different vowels to the three consonants, shin, lamed, mem, shalamem, it can mean, for example, shalem means complete, and the verb means to complete, and from there it can mean to pay, I suppose, because you complete a transaction. So I begin to wonder, does peace perhaps mean completion, closure? Is that how we attain peace? And then I had a sort of coincidence 2 weeks ago when I was reading Torah in another synagogue, the Sidres Vayishlach, and I was down to read the very unpleasant story, I wouldn't thought it would be read here, of Dinah, the rape of Jacob's daughter, Dinah, by the men of Shechem, or by a man of Shechem. It's a complicated story, but the men of Shechem believe Jacob's two murderous sons, who have decided to murder them and do. The men of Shechem are naive, and they say these men are, Anashim Aile are Shalemim. You hear it, Shalamer, Shalemim. And I think it must mean there's something like, these are men of integrity. And there's a marvelous piece of dramatic irony there, because at the very beginning of the parasha it says, and Jacob's sons talked to the men of Shechem with mirma, with deceit. So we know it's a deceit, and the men of Shechem don't, and they think Jacob's sons are Shalemim, men of integrity. Perhaps all these variations of the possible meanings of this Hebrew root, shin, lamed, mem, these are an appropriate matter to meditate on as I wish you Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.